Our Salvation Born, Reflections on the Incarnation. Part 2, Who Do You Say I Am? Our speaker is Jim Kohler.
The letter to the Hebrews, found in the New Testament, is one of the great treasures that we've been given. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who exactly it was written to, and we don't know when it was written. But we do know from the letter itself that it was written to a particular community of Christians, probably Jewish Christians, and then it was written quite early on in the history of the church. This particular group of early Christians was facing some hard times. There are a number of references in the letter itself to particular difficulties or challenges that they were facing. Christianity at that time was new, and it was not on the approved list of religions in the Roman Empire. And as such, Christians were subject to periodic times of persecution, of arrest and trial, and loss of rights, loss of property, exile, and possibly even death. So in these uncertain times, the community was experiencing some real challenges to its own life and to its own existence. From the letter itself, we can see that some believers had chosen to check out. Others were wavering on the verge of checking out. And many others were discouraged and losing hope and losing vision. It's very important to see how the author of the letter to the Hebrews approached this rather challenging situation, because how he approached it can give us an important insight, not just into his pastoral strategy for this particular community, but it gives us an insight into the heart of Christian life itself. His main counsel that he gives to the people in that particular community, and he gives the counsel in a variety of ways, and again he says, look to Jesus, that the key to Christian living is knowing Jesus. It is this key that unlocks the door to the meaning of who Jesus is and what he's come to do, and how we can receive and embrace what he's come to do in our own personal life. The author of Hebrews first begins by focusing on the question of who Jesus is. And he chooses, first of all, in answering that question, to point to the indicators of the divinity of Jesus, that he in fact was God. And he goes on and on with a number of examples, a number of illustrations. You can see he's very intensely concerned with trying to convey to them the reality that Jesus wasn't just a man, but that he was in fact God. And so he says things, for example, like, Jesus is the reflection of God's glory and the imprint of God's very being. He is the heir of all things. He sustains all things by his powerful word. He is seated at the right hand of majesty on high. He has become the source of eternal life and eternal salvation for all who obey him. He goes on to say that Jesus is greater than the angels, he's greater than Moses, he's greater than Melchizedek, he's greater than the high priest, he's greater than the sacrificial system, he's greater than the temple. By a single offering, he says, Jesus has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. Jesus is the embodiment of all three main offices in the Old Testament. That is the office of prophet, one who speaks for God, the office of priest, one who accomplishes forgiveness of sins for the people, and the office of king, who reigns at God's right hand. So the author of Hebrews is using all these images and all these types and all these foreshadowings of the Old Testament because he's struggling mightily to convey to them one central dimension of the mystery of who Jesus is. That Jesus isn't just a mighty messenger of God. He isn't just a mighty miracle worker. He isn't just a prophet or an extraordinarily wise teacher. But he is, in fact, the very imprint, the very representation of God himself. At the same time, the author of Hebrews goes on to say that Jesus isn't just, I shouldn't say just, that Jesus isn't only God, but he's also a human being. He says, "Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things. He had to become like his brothers and sisters in every way, so that he might be a merciful high priest in the service of God, because he was tested by what he suffered, and he is able to help those who are being tested. Goes on to say he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself was subject to their weakness. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one whom in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin." So the author of Hebrews, in trying to encourage the brothers and sisters in this early Christian community, is pointing to the reality of the incarnation, the reality of the second person of the Trinity, taking on both human nature and being who he is in the nature of God. The author goes on to say, let us see if we can move to the heart of what he's trying to get at when he says that Jesus is the mediator of a new and better covenant. The author of Hebrews is talking about the word covenant, and he uses that word covenant 14 different times in his letter, which is more than any other author in the New Testament. Covenant is in Hebrew the word berith, which means to bind together. It was a word that was used to describe the binding together of persons in a business deal, the binding together of persons in a friendship, or the binding together of people in a relationship with God. The Old Covenant in the early days of the Israelite history was made with Abraham and then developed more fully with Moses. And it had in it the three aspects of the law, the temple, and the priesthood. And all three of those things, the law, the temple, and the priesthood, were concerned with the issue of how to deal with and how to remove the main obstacle that gets in the way of men and women being united to God. For it's in being united to God that we can find the true meaning and fulfillment of our life. As the Psalm says, fullness of life is to be found in the presence of God. Yet they couldn't enter into the presence of God because of the reality of this untractable sin that was in human beings' very core. God gave the people the law, which is an expression of how to live in trust and dependence upon God, but they couldn't or didn't live by it. He gave them the priesthood, where priests would offer sacrifices for their sins, but the priests themselves were under the reign of sin, and how could the blood of animals free men from sin? He gave them the temple, which was to be the place where God could dwell in their midst, but it had become a den of thieves and was destroyed. So in order for the covenant to succeed, God would have to do more than he'd already done. It wasn't a matter of people trying harder. God would have to do something within the human heart itself, from the inside out, giving them a new heart, releasing within them the supernatural ability to respond faithfully to him. That God would have to uphold the covenant not only from his side, but also from our side. The very word covenant itself can help us to see more clearly into the mystery of who Christ is and the mystery of the incarnation, this binding together of lives. Hebrews talks about Jesus as the mediator of a new and better covenant. And what's the mediator? A mediator is one who stands between two parties and who can represent one side to the other so that they can better understand one another and have a better relationship. So who is Jesus mediating between? Well, quite simply, he's mediating between God and human beings, or the human and the divine, so they can know and understand one another in a better way and have a better relationship. Particularly, you need a mediator where there's a big issue that's dividing or separating the two parties. And of course, what separates human beings and God is this reality of sin that human beings couldn't deal with on their own. What the author of Hebrews is struggling so mightily to express is this profound reality that Jesus joined together or covenanted in his own person the divine and the human. That he bound together these two very separate realities, and that he entered into the human and bound it through his very person to the divine, so that in his person the power of God itself overcame sin and death, opening to us the very life of God himself. As a human being, Jesus freely entrusted himself to his Father, which no human being had ever done before. And he was perfected in his humanity through this obedience. And through this entrusting himself to his Father, he overcame disobedience and the world and the flesh and the evil one, and opened up to us a new way to enter into life, a life that he had gained through his suffering, death, and resurrection. Through his agonizing passion and death, he offered the Father the limitless love and trust and obedience that the Father had deserved but had never received. And then the author of Hebrews said, Jesus said, "Here I am, I have come to do your will, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. By his own blood he obtained eternal redemption. He has become a priest not on the basis of his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. In passing through death to divine glory, his human nature was perfected and transformed by divine life, so that by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified." All the manifestations of grace in the Old Testament, the defeat of the Egyptians, the crossing of the Red Sea, the manna, the fire, the cloud, the water from the rock, the whole sacrificial system, the temple, the priesthood, David and all the kings, were all images and types and foreshadowings of Jesus. They all pointed to and found their fulfillment in him. He is God's fullest word, his most complete revelation, that God has emptied himself into the Christ, so that Christ is the very fullness of God himself. And that is man as fully human. He wasn't simply masquerading as a human being, but he knew what it was like to be human. He experienced it from the inside out, that he knew what it was like to be subject to the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. And that's why he is a high priest that we can approach during times of difficulty and trial, and we can approach him with confidence. Because in approaching him, we're approaching the throne of God himself. This reality of who Jesus is as fully man and fully God, and how in our humanity we can access his divinity through who Jesus is, which gives us new hope and new life and a new future. There is an article that you can read by John Henry Newman on the mystery of godliness that I would encourage you to reflect on. There are also a number of passages from the letter to the Hebrews that it would be helpful for you to spend a bit of time reflecting on as well.
This talk has been brought to you by Leaven for Living, a project of the Sword of the Spirit.